I believe that my prayer practice influences my way of being in the world. And so the more I attend to my prayer practice, the more I attend to my relationship with God, the more likely I am to develop into loving action. So loving action is something that I think grows in me every day. In the last couple of weeks, I've found myself getting increasingly frustrated with conspiracy theorists. And I realized that my best approach is to take that generosity of spirit from St. Ignatius of Loyola and presume that they are not intentionally obfuscating, or not intentionally getting things wrong. So instead of arguing directly with them, which always feels personally, I've decided to shift to saying, well, what is the source of your information? Because if we can have a discussion then over the source of the information, I can still treat them with respect. I can still treat them with dignity. My life is the confluence of chemistry and spirituality and education. I have tried over the last 15 years to hold these worlds together. And it is in the holding of those worlds together that I find life, that I find love, that I find inspiration. This is my calling, to hold these things together. And this, in the holding of these things together, is where I find God.
Please welcome Brian McLaren.
Everyone, it's hard to believe it's time to weave together some themes for our last day. Our overall framework for this CONSPIRE conference has been me, us, the world. You know, we all start with me, and that's okay. If we go back to when we were little babies, it was all about me. In fact, I didn't even know that I existed, but it was all about me. I didn't care who I woke up, if I was hungry or needed to be changed or felt uncomfortable. I would cry and I would scream and I would wake anybody up. It was all about me, but that's okay because I had a voice and I had needs and I had to learn how to carve out some space for me in this world. But of course, one of our great struggles is a lot of us way through our whole lives, we still think it's all about me and I'm the only ego around here that matters. And so we begin in the contemplative path. Really our induction into the contemplative path is by saying it's not all about me. I have a place here, I have a voice, my story matters, but it's not the only story. And so we learn to live into the next larger story, the story of my group, my community. I guess it starts for all of us maybe with a very small family, and then it expands out into larger and larger us groups. We get to a certain age and we find out that just as I have the group that I feel a part of and that I feel is so special, other people have other us groups, other in groups to which they belong and where they get their sense of identity. And so for them, the story is the story of us Roman Catholics or of us Southern Baptists or of us Methodists or whatever else. And of course, in other parts of the world, it's us Sunni Muslims or us Shiite Muslims or us Sufi Muslims, or you could just multiply all the different us groups. And a lot of people, they spend their whole lives at that us group level. And that's the ultimate, that's the absolute, that's what comes first, that's what matters. Again, just as I have a story, my story matters, our group has a story, and it matters. But eventually, many of us then begin to open up to a bigger story, the story of the world. It's so interesting, isn't it, that the book of Genesis in the Bible starts off with God's not saying, I created you, but saying I created the universe. God creates the whole big story. It's so great the animals have a place before we do. And when we come, we don't even get a special day just for ourselves. We human beings are part of the day when our fellow living creatures and animals are made. And we are found in part of this big story of mysterious forces, of formless void into which comes planets and stars and everything that we know and everything that we don't know. I thought it was so interesting how Richard warned in his meditation this morning that we can leap too quickly from me and us to the world without really doing the work and learning the lessons of me being a person with a story and being part of one or more groups, each with its own story. And he said, you come to the universal through the particular. And of course, we all know in this path, suffering plays such a big role in it. And the suffering of me prepares me for the suffering of others and the suffering of us. And when one group understands their own suffering, then maybe as a group they develop compassion for the suffering of others. You experience love and empathy in particularity, and then in diversity, and then in universality. Richard took us on a little theological journey into Duns Scotus and the academic theology of his time that was so preoccupied with genus and species, with concepts and categories. And then Duns Scotus comes along and says, listen, it all begins with thisness, this little worm that's there on the path, and that someone's going to step on it. So St. Francis picks it up because this one little creature's life matters. I loved it this morning when Richard dared to disagree with the previous Pope and say that he had misinterpreted Duns Scotus, that thisness is not the path to individualism, that thisness is the beginning and the starting point for us to see the preciousness of everything at all levels, me, us, and then the preciousness of everything. And Jacqui's talk took us right there. For her to talk about Ubuntu, this idea that my being depends on your being, and that I am because we are, this way to both validate my individual existence without eradicating the existence of others. And wasn't it interesting how in Jacqui's talk, she went back to childhood experiences? Listen, I can tell you as someone who's involved in some of the planning here, all of this emphasis on childhood experiences was not mandated. This wasn't a script that we were given, but it just naturally came up through the course of this conference. And she took us back to when she was 5 years old. And she told us the story of blonde-haired Tom and red-haired Tom and Lisa, the girl, the fellow student, her peer, who raced her with the N-word. And how that brought a wound to herself, to her own story, a wound into her own story. And of course, those of us who've paid any attention to history know that this kind of racial wounding has been going on for centuries and centuries. And it's a kind of wounding that we human beings do to one another. Maybe it was because you were not so good at sports and everybody else was good at sports. Maybe it was because your skin looked different, or because your teeth weren't perfect, but almost all of us have some memory of someone giving us that wound. And we can see how then the struggle to say that I matter, that my story matters, becomes in some ways a desperate struggle for survival, to not be raced or disgraced by other people. And then she told the beautiful story of how her mother came in to help in one way, and her father came in to help in another way. And she begins to experience the healthy kind of Ubuntu even in a world where all of our value and the value of every person and everything is contested. I loved her definition of love as non-possessive delight in an individual, non-possessive delight in a group. And then came the story of her black father and her white husband. And in that very personal family story, we get a window into the struggles that are going on in our world. She invited us to ask, what's the name of your life story if your life were a book? And what stories have caused you pain in the chapters of your book? And what do you want the last chapter to be entitled? Fertile ground for some contemplation and meditation and conversation in the days and weeks and months to come. I don't think any of us will forget her story of the good Canadian. And for all the Canadians here, you know that that's a great story, who, in a sense, stepped across all kinds of boundaries to help Jacqui in a hospital after a car crash. She brought us to that beautiful quote from a rabbi, "The ethical life is learning to see." And so I think back to 8 years ago when the first CONSPIRE launched, and to think now we've gone on this journey through these 7 CONSPIREs, and now through these days of this CONSPIRE, and now we're at a place where we both look back and we look forward. Nobody 7 or 8 years ago at the first CONSPIRE could have predicted who would become president between then and now, that we would be living in a global pandemic. Many of you, I bet, when the first CONSPIRE happened, had never even heard of the CAC. But sometime between then and now, someone forwarded you a daily meditation, and you were curious enough that you subscribed, and pretty soon you found your thinking being engaged, and you were drawn in, and now you're part of the 5,100 people who've been here for these shared days. And I suspect that many of you feel the way that I do. You wanted to be part of this event, not just because you were interested in the content, although that certainly has been important and interesting, but also because you feel part of this community, this CAC community. You feel part of this story. Your story intersected with this story. And this is one now of the us groups that your me story belongs to. And for all of us who feel that way, we felt it would be good to conclude this final weaving by weaving in the whole CAC community. And as I've gotten more involved with the Center for Action and Contemplation in the last few years, I just want to tell you, I have come to love this community. I get to meet with living school students who are just amazing, and I get to interact with the other faculty who are just stellar. And I've just got to tell you, I've fallen in love with the staff here in Albuquerque and in other locations. And I just thank God from the bottom of my heart for this team and for this whole community. And that's why I'd like to bring up Michael Poffenberger in this last weaving session to talk about where we are and where we would like to go from here. So welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Brian.
And I just want to say as we begin, I'd like to represent the 5,100 people out there and to thank you and to thank through you the entire staff and the whole staff and tech team here who've helped us for your amazing work in making this possible. I'm so grateful, and I know we've got just a wave of gratitude happening out there. And so I'd like to talk and hear from you about where you feel we are as a community.
Well, it's certainly a privilege to be the person who just sits in the seat and gets to represent that. But of course, it's a great privilege for us to have you all here and to have you all here with us through these last few days. But before we dive into the conversation, I thought maybe we could tee up one more of those excerpts from the conversations with Richard. I think it sets up a little bit of this conversation about what this community can be and what it means in the world today for us to talk about. Great. Without knowing where it would lead us, our conversations over these past few years have produced almost this playbook that you're leaving us here at the CAC to continue this work moving forward. We have the 7 themes that we're wrapping up in our last CONSPIRE conference of your alternative orthodoxy in the contemplative tradition. Just the core baseline theology of how we understand the nature of God and the Trinity, a little bit different in the contemplative traditions and informed by your own Franciscanism. We have the 8 core principles of how we go about our programming here at CAC and the lessons we really hope to impart for our community. We have this idea of playing this role as a gateway to the contemplative path, speaking to those questions that people have in their own hearts, reaching them in sometimes these experiences of unknowing and introducing them to where contemplative wisdom and practice can actually meet them. We have core values now of really extrapolating what were the animating values that you had upon founding the CAC. And all of these things are going to be the playbook for how we build new partnerships, bring in new voices, and function moving forward as an organization.
You said it well, Michael. My hope is not any kind of, not just Richard self-promotion, but CAC self-promotion. If we're doing our work correctly, we're affirming and validating other parallel groups, and you've really worked on that, as did some previous executive directors, to create partnerships. You and others have been very generous in sharing our resources, financial resources, with groups that are able to do this part, that part, better than we do. We can't do all parts, but if we can be an energizer, a multiplier, that, like John the Baptist, point beyond ourselves to other groups who are better at nonviolence, who are better at community building, who are, we've just got to keep saying the contemplative mind will do that best. Yeah. Teaching of nonviolence, for example, or anything, any gospel issue.
Nonviolence is almost impossible to comprehend without a contemplative orientation, yeah.
Or you just get angry prophets who themselves are part of the problem in very short order. And we've both seen it. So yeah, that's our work. It's not to draw people here. It's, we hope to have enough of their trust to point them where Jesus is pointing them. If, in other words, our hope is not that this here is perfect, but that our credibility is based on the lives we've changed. God has changed, grace has changed. Look at some of these rather holistic people that frankly I'm very proud of. I hope you are too. And that keeps eyes off of us. Yeah. Because CAC is going to continue to make mistakes. So if you're looking for a perfect institution, we're not it.
Yeah.
And we don't have to be. And there is no such thing. Yeah. Go ahead.
The way I think about it is that our integrity as an institution, our success as an institution is a function of our ability to be faithful to what you founded us to be. And it's faithful to what's happening out there. It's in service to the community that's gathered. It's in service to the kind of transformation that is bubbling up, not just here in CAC, but we're able to connect with because it's the hunger that we experience in so many different places, and that we help people learn how to trust and to continue to cultivate and to serve.
Lovely. Thank you. No, that's good.
Okay.
You know, as we listen to that conversation you had with Richard, I'm aware that for some people, Richard and the CAC are still kind of one and the same. And that's certainly understandable, but it seems to me, well, that Richard never wanted this to be about him. He wanted this to be about the message and the life And that's really why these CONSPIRE conferences were launched, to say, here's the core of my teaching. I want to get my teaching out there. I want the focus to be on this message. And, you know, I love Richard so much, and part of what I feel is that we have to give him the gift of letting him still be a member of this community, but not making it all about him and not putting all the pressure on him. I mean, we've got to let him as a human being, if we love him as a human being, we've got to let him hand the reins over and share responsibility and be at the stage of life where he is. I've certainly felt that in the way I've been welcomed into the Living School and watched him just want to share and empower others with that message, so that the message is carried on in all of us, you know. But I have a feeling for some of the 5,100 people who are part of this conversation, this is probably a struggle. It probably is difficult.
Yeah. Well, and I would count myself in that. I mean, Richard has been my own primary spiritual teacher now for over a decade. But his own desire to really prepare the way for this work to be given away, really to allow room for others to step into it and to carry it forward at this stage in his life became, I think, in a lot of ways, the impetus that we needed to separate the purpose from the person, if you will. You know, Richard, he's impacted so many people's lives. He's a larger-than-life teacher and personality, and so it's hard sometimes to distinguish those things from each other. But that's been the process of doing that with him at this stage in his life.
Well, and I think about what's happened just in the last few years, you know, with the explosion of the daily meditations and of the wide array of podcasts and how far the impacts are going on top of the books that have, you know, gone all around the world. And the CAC is already doing so much, but I imagine that it could be crushing at times to have people bringing all their expectations and their next great idea of what the CAC should do, and probably they're bringing a lot of that to you. I just wondered how you're managing that.
Yeah, well, it's easy to forget sometimes. It's a privilege to be in that position. Richard, I think, in some ways, he's a pioneer. He's trying to be part of this recovery that's underway of the contemplative wisdom of our own Christian tradition. But he's the first one to admit his gift is an intuitive one. He talks about this frequently if you've listened to him at conferences and his recordings. You know, he leads more by reacting to things than he does by being able to say exactly what the vision is, what does success look like, you know? And in some ways, I think it served him well because he never went into this with a plan, with a vision, with I'm going to create this, you know. It just, CAC's whole history of 35 years has just kind of unfolded one chapter after the next. And so for us in this process, we had to really just partner with him, with our board, our staff, our faculty, peers like yourself and other teachers. And it's unfolded in these last few years just kind of as this gradual, prolonged conversation of getting clearer and clearer of what really was the purpose behind how Richard founded the CAC. That's the task that we want to be faithful to as we continue to carry it forward.
So I understand that right now you and the board and the staff are working on a kind of 5-year plan and a roadmap, and to get some clarity so that all of us don't pile on with our expectations going in 1,000
Well,
different
we welcome the
directions.
feedback and the ideas, of course, yeah. Yes, so the basic idea, Richard, when he started the CAC, it's this idea of being an experiential school, right? It's not just about teaching these ideas and tracing them back. It's about inviting people into transformative encounters. And when we look back over our whole history, Richard, you know, it's kind of meandering in a lot of ways. He talks about scripture. He's had his whole decade where he was focused almost exclusively on the men's spirituality. He was one of the very early kind of ambassadors and teachers of the Enneagram. But in all of it, there's this very consistent through thread. Yeah. He creates all these little access points, but all of it comes back to, as you heard him say, I think in that last video clip, of how can whatever it is that we're doing, how can we be doing it from this ground of the contemplative mind?
Yes.
And so what we talk about as CAC's role is really to be that gateway, to help introduce people into Christian contemplative wisdom and practice. And actually it's in our new mission statement. It's introduce Christian contemplative wisdom and practices that support transformation and inspire loving action. And that's really.
Could you give that one more time?
Yeah, sure. Introduce Christian contemplative wisdom and practices that support transformation and inspire loving action.
So practices, personal transformation, loving action in the world.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow, that clarity, I think, really, really helps. Because it can become crushing if you run off in 1,000 directions. Yeah. You know, it's interesting for me as a writer. Of course, Richard's one of the few people I know who's written a lot more books than I have. But I know in my own career, I had no idea where I was going. I would put this message out there, and then a new set of questions would arise, and I'd have to deal with that. And I think in some ways, we're at a point, the CAC is at a point where that through line wasn't clear, 20 years ago.
No.
But now looking back, it is, and that's going to change the way we go forward. In other words, we might have been wandering around a lot in the past as the way of discovering this path, but now we get this amount of clarity to move ahead. And part of that has involved finding partners. And that's, to me, this is something pretty new in this CONSPIRE conference, to be getting the sense that, we want to encourage other organizations and movements so that we can fly in formation, so to speak.
That's right. Yeah, we sometimes think of it as the metaphor of the body of Christ. As we get clear, throughout history, there have been these schools that arise that help nurture this new consciousness when it's needed in the world. That's the task that we want to be faithful to. But we're under no delusion that that's enough, right, for these times. It's gonna take a whole body, a whole community, a whole movement of complementary efforts, grounded in a shared vision, grounded in a shared values, grounded in a shared experiential knowing of God's presence in our life, carrying on all sorts of different efforts. So we've begun to use this phrase, the Christian contemplative movement, or the emerging Christian contemplative movement. We see this generational shift that's underway, where we had, in our own lineage and tradition, we had these pioneers. Richard talks about Thomas Merton a lot. He's certainly one that a lot of us, look back to as at the forefront of this modern recovery of the contemplative stream within Christianity. And Richard's very much building on that same project. But now for those of us who are carrying it forward, there's the tasks that come after that. There is, how do we build communities of practice, revitalize our understanding of our theologies, and pioneer new ways of living this out in the world together. And so everything we've done at this conference has been trying to kind of role model that or practice that, from featuring those beautiful role model stories. By the way, folks recorded those on their iPhones and sent us just their own little stories of ways, whether it's the practice of biology or being a pastor or being an activist, the 1,000 different ways this has to look when it shows up in the world. So whether it's role models that we can each learn from and apply to our own context, or actual partner organizations who are saying, yeah, now let's take it out into the streets with the Poor People's Campaign, or let's take it deeper into an ongoing community of practice through our friends at Contemplative Outreach, or whatever that movement can look like outside CAC. That is absolutely key to it. For Richard, just to say it as simply as possible, his vision in supporting CAC was to support a movement of people who are putting this message and this practice into life in the world.
So we're kind of looking back and saying the through line has become clear, but now comes a new exploration period, because there's going to be all kinds of new ways that this movement begins to build. And the movement, in some ways, it's been building and emerging in many different contexts. As Richard was living this out in his Roman Catholic background, I know I was in a Protestant background where the same spirit was at work. And now we're envisioning where this could go. And it seems to me one of the critical realities we have to face is that, Richard won't be around for 50 years or, and so now we have to take this issue of founder succession seriously. This really strikes me because I was a founder. I've started a couple of organizations, but I was a co-founder of a local church. And the skills that made me a good founding pastor also brought me to a place where I almost ruined what I'd created because the organization needed leadership skills that I hadn't practiced. I'll never forget, Michael, a member of my board took me out to breakfast one day, and I could tell he was getting serious, and he sets his coffee cup aside and he looks at me and he says, "Brian, the greatest threat to this church is your next new idea."
I think I've heard that one before, actually.
You have too?
Yeah.
So then he just starts telling me, and of course I'm a little defensive and I'm a little shocked because I didn't see this coming. But he said to me, "You don't understand, Brian. We love you. And we're busy trying to put into practice your last 25 new ideas." Well, see, I'm a creative person. And I had this belief at that moment that every problem could be solved by a new idea. It's part of what made me a good founder and a good, leader in that stage. And I reached this critical moment where I had to have almost a conversion. And it wasn't just me, but it was our congregation to say, we're entering a new stage. What we might need most right now is not a new idea, but better organization or a better budget or facilities. I built this, significantly sized church, and we never solved the facilities problem for 19 years. So, but I look back on that experience of mine, and I just think how significant it was, not only for me, but for my congregation or my leaders to reach a point where they said, the future is going to be different from the past. And that didn't mean that my creative ideas weren't so important. It meant that I had new ways to express them. I wouldn't have become an author if that hadn't have happened. But it also meant change in the organization, new people's talents and skills to arise, and new levels of complexity in the organization in some ways. I know that you're thinking about all that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, for those who've been in our community for more than just the last couple of years, you probably know, I think 2016, Richard was diagnosed with prostate cancer and was given an initial prognosis of 3 years. And then just a couple years ago had what they call the Widowmaker heart attack in his main line. And so we've almost lost him now twice, and feel so blessed for lots of obvious reasons that he's still an active part of this mission in this community. But I also think in some respects, I wonder if that was the kind of kick in the pants God was giving us to think more critically about some of these questions with him. The first thing I would say, for us, we have to start with just a posture of trust.
Yes.
Whatever happens, it's okay.
Yes.
If I've learned anything from Richard, it has to be that. And as leaders and people who are trying to do things in the world, sometimes I think that's the hardest thing for us to remember, for anybody really to remember, that at the end of the day, it's all okay already.
Yes.
Whatever happens.
Yeah.
Whatever happens. I know Richard would want us to know that. To put that more practically, this big shift in consciousness, it's happening not just in Christianity, it's happening everywhere.
Yes.
And we're just one part of it. What's moving in the world right now, what's arising. And we are, what an awesome opportunity to get to play some small part in trying to see it and support it and bring it to bear in the world. But it's certainly not dependent on us. So first I would want to say that's one thing, to just be grounded in that reality as much as we can. When we started, and then there comes the practical, right? How do we actually plan for this? How do we actually do this? So when we started thinking more critically about succession, we talked to peers, studied a lot of the literature, you know, in conversation with Richard, there were three kind of mistakes really that a lot of organizations make that we wanted to learn from and really to avoid. One was not planning at all. You know, for a lot of organizations going through founder transition or succession, it hits you like a ton of bricks. And if you're not prepared for it, it can be catastrophic for the organization. A lot of times founders themselves can be, you know, part of the challenge of helping them release this thing that they gave life to out in the world, which fortunately, you know, for Father Richard hasn't been an obstacle for us. So not planning for it would be one. The second one would be kind of being deluded that there is a replacement for the founder.
Yeah.
You must have gone through this in some ways.
Oh, yeah.
In the community. There's a unique role. Like Richard holds formal and informal, so many different functions for us as an organization. And I'm sure for many of you in the community, his gifts, he called them idiosyncratic.
Yeah.
There's no one person who's just going to step in and somehow, if I can say, fill the Richard-sized hole in all of our lives and hearts. For those of us who consider him a primary teacher.
Yeah.
So trying to just directly replace that would put too much pressure on anybody. And the third would be making the mistake of thinking that it's about the founder as a person rather than the founder's purpose, or rather than what the founder is about. That's been really the theme of our whole process is how do we help enable the CAC, equip this whole community to be about what Richard is about. He talked about that as his love language in that video as well. I can say without any doubt or hesitation that nothing would horrify Richard more than the idea that CAC as an organization became some kind of monument to him as a person.
We've all heard him say that.
Yeah, that's his whole critique of Christianity and Christianity's relationship to Jesus. Yeah, so that's some of what we're working to be prepared for just on a practical level. We recognize that what has been developed here through Richard, through this community, can be of use, and we just want to allow that service to be sustained in this next generation of the work.
So it feels to me, as you say that you're inviting all of us to say, let's be ready for the organization to go through that process, and let's not hold on, let's not just hunker down, but now let's take that purpose, that through line that's become clear looking back, and let's extend that out, and let's all of us imagine how we can pick up the baton and do our part.
Yes, you said it. Yeah. Really, what else is there to say? If I can say, there's a couple things I would love to invite our community's partnership, prayers, discernment, and support with. One is joining all of us here who are on the team in allowing the future to look different. I think it's going to be a process for everybody. Allowing, again, for those of us for whom Richard has been a primary teacher, allowing Richard to not have to be the center of our spiritual paths and work of awakening. He's already doing the work of bringing in other teachers, of showing us, laying the foundations with his core theology, helping us figure out how to translate that, in these next 5 years in particular. Bringing in new voices that are adding their own incredible gifts. I mean, each of our teachers this weekend has just been, yourself very much included, Brian, has just been exceptional. So the future is going to look different. We all have to allow ourselves and allow that to unfold as it will. And then the second thing is just join us in creating the next chapter of this movement. I think Richard, again, to talk about that love language of how do we be about what he's about. Nothing gives him greater joy. I've seen him. People ask him when he goes to speak somewhere, hey, is there something we can get you as a thank you gift? He said, nothing gives me more joy than seeing other people who are about in the world what inspires me. And so for all of us who are here, that means doing the work, showing up to our cushions, showing up to each other, being open to being on this path together and showing up in the world in the ways that are so desperately needed in these times. CAC as an organization, we're going to be there to be a source of encouragement and continued teaching and partnerships with new faculty and, another generation of work. I feel so good about that. But it's going to take all of us showing up to it together.
That's great. And so Richard did it primarily through being a teacher. And then around him has grown an organization that's helped amplify and expand that message. But for some folks, it's being a biologist. And for other folks, it's being a doctor or a teacher. Or the really, really important one, a parent.
Yeah, yes.
And now saying, what I'm learning, how is this going to be translated? And there is so much work to do in this.
Yeah.
To think that we've finished articulating these 7 themes, it's all done. No, now the exciting creative work really explodes.
An awake doctor, an awake biologist, an awake parent who by our awakenness is helping others wake up too.
Yes. Well, as I was thinking about this final session, I composed a prayer that I would like to share as a kind of closing to this final weaving. So I invite all of you to join me in this prayer. Holy One, living light, generous creator and companion of every this. Thank you for what we have shared in these days together. We desire, we ask for a deeper sense of Ubuntu, the realization that none of us is an island, that we are all connected in your great story and your great love. As our indigenous family reminded us when this conference began, we are all relations, all part of the story of the living earth. We are all encircled as in one great drum, brought together in one great rhythm. All 5,100 of us joined together to pray for the CAC, for each staff member, for each faculty member, for each board member. We ask your love and wisdom to pour into the CAC at every level, including us. And we pray that the wisdom and skills we receive and develop will flow through us all, for the healing of this beautiful and fragile world. While many conspire for greed, and many conspire for power, and many conspire for supremacy and domination, may your Spirit fill us, Holy One, to follow the way of Jesus, joining in a creative and liberating conspiracy for your peace, your shalom, your Ubuntu for all. Amen.
Amen.
We have one more clip from Michael's conversation with Richard. Some final words before our Iona liturgy.
Richard, you're such a pioneer for so many of us in this work. And as a closing question, I want to ask if there's anything you want to say, any hopes or parting pieces of wisdom or advice for those not just here in the CAC, but in our whole community around the world who really do feel that hunger and that desire to carry forward this work that you're doing and the message that you've been trying to build here at the CAC.
You know, if you're going to be true to Jesus, and that's all I want, the 2 virtues I most have an eye for, that you can usually recognize in the first 10 minutes of talking to somebody, is humility, and now I'm going to add a tag virtue too. But the first 2 are humility and honesty. If either of those are missing, don't trust it. It's not the gospel. If it isn't making you more humble and more honest, first of all, about yourself, your own shadow, your own country, your own religion, don't believe it. It's not the gospel. It's not good news. It's bad news. And the one I add, I was happy to hear Pope Francis said it this week, so I have his blessing. He said he's really tired of Christians who don't have a sense of humor. And that's just a tag, but it really is a giveaway of a healthy psyche. And I only gained a sense of humor in these last years of my life. I think people who knew me in my early years would say, oh, he's prophetic and he's wise, but he's a little serious. I was terribly serious most of my early years, and God forgive me. People forgive me. If the message integrated in you is not giving you a sense of humor about yourself, your own limitations, a sense of humor about America, a sense of humor about the Christian church, the only alternative is bitterness. And I've met too many bitter liberals, and we're not interested in that.
Thank you, Richard.
You're welcome.
For all of it, for everything. I'm very confident I'm speaking on behalf of countless other people who have been touched in profound ways by your work, but thank you.
You're welcome, and you're welcome. Now do it. Let's do it together, and do it after I die, and I'll be totally happy. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.